The $500 bills were still fluttering to Patricia Coleman's doormat when Daniel Brooks realized he'd spent the last 5 years funding his father's slow starvation. Not intentionally. Not consciously. But $72,000 had gone somewhere. And it sure as hell wasn't into the sagging porch or the peeling paint, or the body of the 72-year-old veteran, currently holding an empty plate like it was a prayer. Before we go any further, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means a lot to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Now, let's begin. The twist, the part that would make Daniel's hands shake for weeks afterward, was that he'd been so proud of himself. So damn proud of those monthly transfers, of being the kind of son who didn't forget where he came from, who took care of the man who'd taken care of him. $1,200, every single month, like clockwork, responsibility, gratitude, love, expressed in the only language Silicon Valley really understood. Money moved efficiently from one account to another. Except Thomas Brooks, the man those transfers were meant to save, had been begging neighbors for rice. And Daniel had no idea, until he showed up unannounced at 4:30 on a Tuesday morning, standing on Maple Street, with organic apples in a paper bag and a briefcase full of acquisition documents, watching his father perform the particular kind of degradation that happens when dignity meets hunger and loses. So the question wasn't whether Daniel had abandoned his father. The question was whether you could abandon someone while actively trying to save them. Whether good intentions counted for anything when the systems you trusted were run by thieves. And whether a billionaire's money meant anything at all if he was too busy building empires to notice the foundation was crumbling. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind 6 hours, to when Daniel Brooks thought he was one of the good ones. Daniel had left San Francisco at 4 in the morning, because something in Thomas's voice during their last call had sounded wrong. Hollowed out, like an echo of an echo. They'd talked for maybe 8 minutes, the usual surface-level update, Thomas asking about the business, and Daniel offering vague reassurances about growth and projections, and the acquisition that was supposed to close this week. Normal, fine. Except for that quality in his father's voice, that thing Daniel couldn't name but recognized in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive when he was 14 and angry and living in a system that processed kids like paperwork. Thomas had said he was fine, had said everything was good, not to worry, focus on the important stuff. Had said all the things parents say when they're protecting their children from reality. And Daniel, because he wanted to believe it, because the alternative meant confronting things he'd been avoiding for half a decade, had chosen to hear the words instead of the space between them. But that instinct, that 14-year-old survival mechanism that success and money and corner offices hadn't quite erased, kept nagging. Kept suggesting that fine wasn't fine, that good wasn't good, that something was desperately wrong, and Daniel was the only one close enough to see it. So he'd cancelled his morning meetings, told his assistant to reschedule everything, and driven to the airport before he could talk himself out of it. 3-hour flight, rental car, 90 minutes of highway and surface streets, and finally, Maple Street itself, the street he'd grown up on after Thomas had taken in a kid nobody else wanted. The house looked worse than he remembered. Worse than it should have looked given the money he'd been sending. The porch that Thomas had always kept pristine, now sagged in the middle like a broken promise. The paint, which had been fresh and white 6 years ago when Daniel left for Stanford, had surrendered to entropy and weather, leaving bare wood exposed like bones through skin. The front yard, which Thomas used to maintain with military precision, because old habits from the service died hard, was overgrown and wild. And there, on that dying porch, in a folding chair that looked like it had survived more than furniture should have to survive, sat Thomas Brooks. 72 years old. 20 pounds lighter than the last time Daniel had seen him, though Daniel hadn't seen him in person for 5 years, so maybe it was more. Holding an empty plate in both hands and staring at the neighbor's door with the kind of hope that made Daniel's chest hurt, the desperate kind, the kind that came from being hungry long enough that dignity became negotiable. Daniel stood there on the cracked sidewalk, briefcase in one hand and grocery bag in the other, and watched his father prepare to beg. Not with words yet, just with posture. With the way Thomas was sitting forward in that chair, shoulders curved inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller, more acceptable, less of an imposition on a world that had apparently decided he was too much trouble. The neighbor's door opened. Daniel saw his father's face transform, saw hope do that terrible thing it does when it's been starving, becomes frantic, loses its grace. Thomas, Patricia Coleman stood in her doorway holding a casserole dish like it was evidence at a trial. She was maybe 60, with the kind of haircut that required appointments and the kind of expression that came from a lifetime of measuring people's worth against her convenience. "I told you yesterday I can't keep doing this." Thomas's voice, when he spoke, cracked something fundamental in Daniel's chest. "I know, Patricia, I know, and I wouldn't ask, but the check didn't come through again this month and I've got about a can of soup left and I just thought, if you had anything, even just some rice or, you said that last month." Patricia's tone was the special kind of cruel that people use when they want credit for not being crueler. "And the month before, Thomas, I have my own expenses, my own family. I can't be responsible for feeding you just because your son abandoned you." That word. Abandoned. It hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun already fired. Daniel felt his whole body go still in the way it used to when he was younger, when stillness was the only thing standing between him and violence, when the world was divided into threats and everything else and you had to know which was which before they knew you were watching. But this wasn't that. This was worse. Because this was his fault. The checks he'd been sending, $1,200 every month for 5 years, routed through an account he'd set up specifically for Thomas, those checks had apparently been going somewhere else. Or nowhere at all. Or into pockets that didn't belong to the man who taught him that family wasn't about blood, it was about who showed up when showing up was hard. And Daniel hadn't shown up. Not in 5 years. Not since he'd left for Stanford on that scholarship, then stayed for the startup, then stayed for the Series A funding, then stayed because staying was easier than coming back to face what he'd left behind. Success, he'd learned, was a fantastic excuse for absence. You could call it building a future, call it making something of yourself, call it any number of aspirational things that sounded good in founder interviews and TED Talks, and people would nod and understand, and sometimes even applaud. But standing here watching his father beg for rice from a woman who'd probably never missed a meal in her life, Daniel understood that success was also just another word for gone. "I'm not abandoned," Thomas said, and his voice had that quality that broke Daniel clean in half. That tone that meant a person was defending something they weren't sure they believed anymore. "Daniel sends money. He's just busy. He's doing important work out in California. He's building something that matters. If he sends money, where is it?" Patricia's question was reasonable, which somehow made it worse. "Where's the car he promised you? Where's the home repair? Where's anything that shows this successful son of yours gives a damn about whether you live or die?" Daniel moved then, crossed the 30 feet of cracked sidewalk between him and the porch in about 4 seconds flat, took the steps 2 at a time, despite the way they groaned in protest like they might give up entirely. Thomas looked up, and for a moment didn't recognize him, which made sense because the last time they'd seen each other Daniel had been 23, and hungry in a different way, hungry for something to prove, and now he was 28, and filled up with things that didn't matter as much as he'd thought they would. "Dad." The word came out, rough, unused. He hadn't said it in a while, hadn't said it enough before he left, and now it felt too small for what it was trying to carry, too inadequate for the weight of 5 years and $72,000 missing dollars, and a good man brought low by systems that were supposed to protect him. Thomas stood up so fast the folding chair fell over backward, made a metallic clatter that sounded like punctuation, like the end of one sentence and the beginning of another. "Daniel?" His father's hands came up like he was going to hug him, then stopped halfway like he wasn't sure he was allowed, like maybe the distance between them was measured in more than miles, was calculated in missed calls and postponed visits and all the ways that love could exist alongside neglect. "What are you doing here? You didn't call. I would have cleaned up. Why are you asking her for food?" Daniel kept his voice level, but something in it made Patricia take a step back into her doorway, made her remember suddenly that the kid Thomas had adopted hadn't been the nice kind, had been the kind with a juvenile record, and eyes that knew how to find weakness and exploit it. "Where's the money I've been sending?" Thomas's face did something complicated then, a whole conversation happening in the muscles around his eyes and mouth. Shame and confusion, and something that looked like relief that Daniel was here at all, that someone was finally asking questions that needed asking. "The money, son, I haven't seen any money. I thought you were still getting on your feet. I didn't want to ask. I know how expensive California is. I know you're building something important." The world tilted slightly to the left. Daniel pulled out his phone with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, because he'd learned a long time ago how to keep his body still, even when everything inside was chaos. Pulled up the banking app, the account he'd set up 5 years ago with Thomas's name on it, the account that showed 60 deposits of $1,200 each, $72,000 total, all of it marked as transferred, all of it supposedly delivered. All of it gone. Who has access to this account? He turned the phone toward his father, watched Thomas's eyes scan the screen, watched confusion become understanding, become something darker, something that looked like rage filtered through exhaustion and resignation. I set it up in your name. Only you should be able to touch it. Thomas's hands were shaking when he took the phone, held it close because his reading glasses was somewhere inside, probably. Somewhere in the house that was falling apart, despite Daniel sending enough money to fix it 3 times over. I never set up any account. Never got any calls from a bank. Never signed anything about this. His voice dropped to something quieter, something more dangerous. But about 6 months after you left, someone came by from the county. Said there was paperwork I needed to sign for your student aid. Retroactive stuff, tax forms. Said if I didn't sign it would mess up your funding. Might cost you your scholarship. The cold that went through Daniel then was the kind that lived in bone marrow, that set up residence and didn't leave. Who came by? Some official-looking guy. Had a badge, had forms, seemed legitimate. Your caseworker from when you were a minor was with him, vouched for him. Gerald Morrison. Said it was all standard procedure, happened all the time with foster kids who went to college. Thomas looked up from the phone, and his eyes had that thing in them that Daniel remembered from childhood, that combination of fierce intelligence and hard-won wariness that had helped both of them survive more than they should have had to survive. I signed a lot of things that day. Didn't read them all, they made it seem urgent, said you'd called and okayed it, said we needed to move fast or you'd lose your funding. Daniel felt the pieces clicking into place with the particular precision of a lock being picked by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My caseworker. Gerald Morrison. That's him. Thomas handed the phone back. Haven't seen him since that day, actually. He retired about a year later, moved to Florida, I heard. Bought himself a nice place down there, someone told me. Good for him, I thought. Man deserved a comfortable retirement after all those years helping kids like you. Of course he did, Daniel thought. Of course he moved to Florida. Of course he bought a nice place. On money that was supposed to keep a good man from begging his neighbors for rice, on money stolen from people who'd already had everything stolen from them once by circumstance, and again by a system that was supposed to make things better. The rage that moved through him then was the old kind, the kind he'd learned to channel into code and business plans and late-night work sessions, where he turned anger into algorithms and spite into success. But it was still rage, still had teeth, still wanted blood. Patricia was still standing in her doorway, holding her casserole dish like a shield, and Daniel turned to look at her, with the full weight of exactly who he'd become in the 5 years he'd been gone. You said my father's son abandoned him. Daniel kept his voice conversational, which was more threatening than yelling would have been. And Patricia seemed to understand this on an instinctual level, seemed to recognize that she'd stumbled into something larger and more dangerous than a simple neighbor dispute. I'm that son. And I've been sending money every month for 5 years. $72,000 that apparently never made it to the man it was intended for. So I'm gonna need you to explain something to me, Patricia. He took a step closer to her doorway, watched her grip tighten on the casserole dish until her knuckles went white. How many times over the last few years did my father come to you for help? How many times did you turn him away? How many times did you watch him get thinner, watch this house fall apart, watch a 72-year-old veteran go without meals, and decide that your casserole was too precious to share? Patricia's face went red, then pale, then settled on a mottled combination of both that suggested her body couldn't decide which flavor of shame to display. I didn't know you were actually sending money, he never said. He just kept showing up, and I thought he was one of those people who just expects handouts, who doesn't even try. He raised me, Daniel cut her off, when the system gave up. When everyone else saw a broken kid with anger issues and a future that looked like a cell block, he saw someone worth saving. So no, Patricia, he doesn't try in the way you apparently mean. He doesn't grovel the right way. He doesn't perform poverty to your satisfaction. He just quietly goes without, and tries not to be too much trouble, because that's what good people do, and you mistook that for weakness. He pulled out his wallet, extracted 5 $100 bills, held them out toward her like they were contaminated. Here, for all the meals you didn't give him, for all the times you could have been a decent neighbor, and chose judgment instead. Consider it payment for a lesson in empathy, though I'm not optimistic about your capacity to learn. Patricia stared at the money like it might bite her, like accepting it would mean admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. I don't want your money. I don't care what you want. Take it. Donate it. Use it to buy yourself a conscience if they're selling those these days. Daniel let the bills flutter to her doormat, watched them settle like leaves, like evidence. And when people ask you about the billionaire's father who lived next door, who you watched struggle and did nothing to help, you make sure you tell them this part too. Tell them what happened when the billionaire came home. He turned back to Thomas, who was watching this exchange with an expression that held about 17 different emotions, none of them simple, all of them valid. Dad, grab whatever you need from inside. You're coming back to San Francisco with me tonight. Daniel, I can't just leave. I've got the house. You've got nothing here that can't be handled remotely. The house needs 6 months of renovation before it's livable, and that's not happening with you in it. We'll hire contractors, get it fixed properly, rent it out or sell it or keep it, whatever you want, but you're not staying here another night. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, and Daniel saw the moment his father stopped trying to be the adult in the conversation, stopped trying to hold things together with pride and stubbornness and willpower that had been stretched too thin for too long. Saw the exhaustion win. Okay, Thomas said quietly. Okay, let me just pack a bag. While his father disappeared into the house, Daniel made 4 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to his lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Stevens who'd helped him navigate 2 acquisitions and a patent dispute, and knew how to find things people wanted to stay hidden. Rebecca, I need you to trace a fraud case. Elderly financial abuse. I'll send you the details, but the short version is, someone's been stealing from my father for 5 years, and I want everything. Bank records, signatures, paper trails, all of it. And I want the names of everyone involved. Rebecca didn't ask questions, which was why Daniel paid her an obscene amount of money, just said, quote, I'll have a preliminary report by tomorrow morning. Do we care about keeping this quiet? No. I want it loud, I want it visible. I want everyone who thought they could steal from a 72-year-old veteran, because he didn't have anyone watching his back, to understand exactly how watched he was. The second call was to his assistant, Andrew, who answered on the first ring despite it being 9 at night, because that was also why Daniel paid him an obscene amount of money. I need the jet ready to leave from San Jose in 4 hours. 2 passengers. And get me the contact information for every local and national reporter who's ever covered elder abuse cases. I'm about to give them a story. The third call was to his accountant. I need a full audit of the Thomas Brooks assistance account. Every transaction, every transfer, every person who touched it. And I need a forensic accountant who specializes in fraud. Money is no object, time is. The fourth call was to someone he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. A guy named James Carter, who'd been 2 years ahead of him at Stanford, and now ran a non-profit, focused on systemic reform, in social services. James, it's Daniel Brooks. I need to know everything about how caseworkers can exploit the people they're supposed to help. And I need to know it fast, because I'm about to burn down whoever thought they could steal from mine. James whistled low. That's specific, you okay? Not even a little bit. But I will be once I've finished dismantling some lives. You still do that consulting thing where you help people navigate the system. That's literally my entire job. Good. Because I'm about to fund the hell out of it. And I need you to help me make sure what happened to my father doesn't happen to anyone else. By the time Thomas came back out with a duffel bag that looked like it had served in 2 wars and a personal conflict, Daniel had a plan. Not a complete plan, not a perfect plan, but a plan that involved lawyers and reporters and forensic accountants, and the kind of public accountability that made people in positions of power very nervous. His father looked at him, looked at the phone still in his hand, and something like the old Thomas surfaced. The one who'd taught Marcus that there was a difference between revenge and justice, but both had their place. You're going after them. It wasn't a question. Every single one of them. The caseworker who forged your signature, the bank that didn't verify, the system that let this happen. All of it. Daniel pocketed his phone, picked up his father's duffel bag, because Thomas had carried enough for long enough. And I'm going to do it in a way that makes sure it's harder for it to happen to the next person. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly, and Daniel saw pride there, saw approval, saw the man who'd raised him recognizing that the lessons had stuck, even when it seemed like they hadn't. You turned out okay, kid. Better than okay. Yeah, well, Daniel felt his throat tighten. I had a good teacher, even if I was a lousy student about staying in touch. They walked to the car Daniel had rented at the airport, a Tesla that looked absurdly out of place on this street with its potholes and its carefully maintained distance between neighbors who'd lived beside each other for decades, without quite becoming friends. Patricia was still standing in her doorway, the $500 still on her mat uncollected, watching them with an expression that suggested she was beginning to understand she'd become part of a story that wasn't going to end well for her. "Daniel," she called out, and there was something almost pleading in her voice now, something that recognized too late that casual cruelty had consequences. "I really didn't know about the money. If I'd known. If you'd known, you might have been nicer to him because you thought he had a rich son." Daniel opened the passenger door for Thomas. "That's not the defense you think it is, Patricia. The point is, you should have been kind regardless. You should have helped regardless. That's what neighbors do. That's what decent people do. They don't means test suffering before they decide if it's worthy of a casserole." He got in the driver's side, started the engine. Through the window he could see lights coming on in other houses, curtains twitching. Neighbors finally paying attention now that there was something interesting happening, now that the shabby house with the quiet veteran had produced a son in an expensive suit driving an expensive car. Where were these people 6 months ago, Daniel wondered? Where were they when his father was skipping meals? But he knew the answer. They were where people usually were when someone needed help, carefully not noticing, preserving their own comfort, telling themselves it wasn't their problem until it became entertainment. The drive to the airport gave them time to talk. Really talk, for the first time in years. Thomas told him about the slow degradation of everything, how the roof started leaking 2 winters ago, and he'd patched it with a tarp, because he couldn't afford a roofer. How the furnace died last year, and he'd spent December wearing 3 sweaters and sleeping under every blanket he owned. How he'd sold his car, then his tools, then small things around the house he'd thought Daniel might not remember, trying to stay afloat. How he'd never called because he'd been so sure Daniel was sending money, so sure the system had just delayed it somehow, so sure it would work out, because it had to work out because the alternative was admitting his son had forgotten him. "I didn't forget," Daniel said, and his hands were tight on the steering wheel. "I was just stupid enough to think money alone was enough. I thought, if I sent checks, if I made sure you were financially stable, that was me taking care of you. I didn't think about verifying, didn't think about visiting, didn't think about the fact that you might need more than just funds in an account somewhere. You were building something," Thomas said. "I was proud, am proud. You took everything that was angry and hurt in you, and turned it into something that matters. That's not nothing, son. It's also not enough." Daniel merged onto the highway. "And it's about to become a lot more. Because I'm going to fix this, Dad. All of it. The money, the house, the people who thought they could steal from you. And then I'm going to make sure it's harder for them to do it to anyone else." The preliminary report from Rebecca Stevens came through at 6 the next morning, while Daniel and Thomas were having breakfast in Daniel's apartment, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay and furniture that looked like it had been purchased by someone who'd Googled what successful people owned. Thomas had spent the first 20 minutes just staring out at the water, not saying anything, and Daniel had let him because some things didn't need commentary, some moments of beauty were their own justification. The report was 37 pages of exactly what Daniel had expected, and somehow worse. Gerald Morrison, the caseworker, had been running the same scam on at least 14 other families over a 6-year period, targeting people who'd aged out of the system or whose foster kids had moved away, people who were vulnerable and isolated, and didn't have anyone checking on them. He'd forge signatures on financial documents, redirect funds, file false tax returns, skim money from every available source. Total estimated theft, over $200,000. He'd retired early, bought a condo in Tampa, and apparently thought he'd gotten away with it, because who was going to investigate? Who was going to care about some foster kids, and their aging former guardians? Who had the resources to dig deep enough, to find the truth? The answer, it turned out, was someone who'd taken that anger from being a throwaway kid, and channeled it into becoming the kind of person who could afford very expensive lawyers, and very persistent forensic accountants, and had absolutely no interest in letting this go quietly. Daniel forwarded the report to James Carter with a note. "This is what we're fighting." Then he called the district attorney's office. The conversation went about how he expected. "A lot of we'll look into it, and these things take time, and we appreciate you bringing this to our attention." The kind of bureaucratic soft shuffle that meant nothing would happen fast enough to matter, unless someone applied pressure. So Daniel applied pressure. He called the San Jose Mercury News first, then the Chronicle, then the LA Times, then every tech blog and news outlet that had ever written about him or his company, or done one of those founder profile pieces. Told them all the same story. Successful tech entrepreneur discovers his father, a 72-year-old veteran, has been the victim of elder abuse and financial fraud by the very systems meant to protect him. Sent them all copies of Rebecca's report with names redacted just enough to stay on the right side of libel law, but not so redacted that a competent reporter couldn't fill in the blanks. By noon, his phone was ringing off the hook. By 3 p.m., Gerald Morrison's condo in Tampa had reporters camped outside, asking uncomfortable questions. By 6 p.m., the district attorney's office called back with a very different tone, wanted to assure Daniel they were taking this very seriously, were opening a full investigation, were coordinating with Florida authorities. That's good, Daniel told the ADA who'd been assigned to the case. Because I'm also taking it seriously. Serious enough that I'm setting up a foundation specifically to help other people in my father's situation. Serious enough that I'm funding a legal clinic that will go after every caseworker, every financial institution, every person who thinks they can exploit vulnerable people because those people don't have advocates. You want to get ahead of this, you want to be on the right side when the reporting really starts? I suggest you move fast and move hard. The ADA, a woman named Jennifer Foster who sounded like she'd had about enough of her day already, said, "Mr. Brooks, I appreciate your concern, but we have procedures. I don't care about your procedures. I care about results. And right now the results are that my father spent 5 years slowly starving, while a man you were supposed to oversee stole from him and 13 other families. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to prosecute everyone involved to the fullest extent of the law. You're going to recover every dollar stolen. And you're going to do it visibly enough that the next person who thinks about running this scam understands the consequences. Because if you don't, I will spend every resource I have making sure everyone knows that your office failed these people. Are we clear?" There was a long pause. Then, "Crystal clear, Mr. Brooks, we'll be in touch." Daniel hung up and found Thomas watching him from the kitchen table, coffee mug halfway to his mouth, expression unreadable. "What?" Daniel asked. "You've gotten scary," his father said, but there was something like approval in his voice. "Good scary. The kind of scary that gets things done. I learned from the best. You were terrifying when I was 14, and you told me I could either shape up or ship out, but you weren't going to watch me waste my potential." Thomas smiled, first real smile Daniel had seen since he'd arrived at that house on Maple Street. "You were so angry back then, at everything. At the system, at your biological parents, at the universe for dealing you a bad hand. I wasn't sure I could reach you. You reached me by not trying to fix me. By just being steady and showing up and making it clear that your being there wasn't conditional on me being perfect." Daniel sat down across from him. "Which is why I should have shown up more, should have checked in person, should have done more than just send money and assume everything was fine." "You're here now," Thomas said simply. "That counts." Over the next 2 weeks, things happened fast. Gerald Morrison was arrested in Tampa, charged with 14 counts of fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft. The bank that had processed the transfers without proper verification suddenly discovered they had a very generous settlement offer for all affected families, motivated by the kind of bad publicity that made shareholders nervous. The county social services department launched an internal investigation that ended with 3 supervisors being fired and a complete overhaul of oversight procedures. And Daniel discovered something he hadn't expected. Telling this story publicly, making it impossible to ignore, meant other people started telling their stories too. He got emails from adult foster kids who'd lost touch with their foster parents, and now wondered if they were okay. From elderly people who'd had caseworkers pressure them into signing documents they didn't understand. From families who'd been scammed by people in positions of trust, and had no idea how to fight back, because fighting back required resources they didn't have. So he did what he'd been planning anyway, but bigger. He set up the Brooks Foundation with an initial funding of $10 million, focused specifically on protecting vulnerable adults from financial exploitation. Hired James Carter to run it because James understood the system from the inside and knew where all the bodies were buried. Staffed it with lawyers and social workers and investigators who understood how these scams worked because they'd seen them before, had been powerless to stop them before, and now had resources. Built a hotline, a website, A database of reported cases. Made it loud and visible, and impossible to ignore. 3 months after that morning on Maple Street, Daniel stood in front of a room full of reporters and advocates and social workers, and told them what he'd learned. That systems designed to help people could be weapons when wielded by the wrong hands, that oversight only worked if someone was watching, and that the people most vulnerable to exploitation were often the ones who'd spent their lives helping others, who didn't know how to ask for help themselves. Thomas sat in the front row, looking healthier than he had in years, looking like someone who was eating regularly and sleeping in a house with working heat, and not carrying the weight of wondering if he'd been abandoned by the son he'd saved. Patricia, his former neighbor, was not in the room, but she'd sent a letter. Daniel had read it exactly once, standing in his kitchen at 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep. It was 3 pages of apology, of explanation, of excuses, that didn't quite excuse. She'd included a check for $500, the money he'd left on her doormat, along with a note saying she'd donated an additional $5,000 to the foundation. Daniel had deposited the check and donated it too, doubled it, put it toward funding legal assistance for people like his father. Forgiveness was complicated, and he wasn't sure he was capable of it yet, but he understood that Patricia had been a symptom, not the disease. The disease was a system that made it easy to look away, that made it someone else's problem, that let people like Gerald Morrison operate for years because no one was checking, no one was watching, no one thought the quiet elderly veteran with the falling apart house was worth the effort of a closer look. "What happened to my father happens every day," Daniel told the room. To thousands of people who trusted the system to protect them, and found out too late that trust is sometimes just another word for vulnerability. We can't fix all of it. But we can make it harder. We can make it riskier. We can make it so that the next Gerald Morrison thinks twice before stealing from someone who doesn't have anyone watching their back. He paused, looked at Thomas. And we can make sure that everyone, regardless of whether they have a tech billionaire for a son, has someone watching their back. That's what the Brooks Foundation is for. That's what we're building. The applause was genuine, which was good because Daniel had never been great at public speaking, had always preferred code to crowds, algorithms to audiences. But this mattered more than his comfort. This was about making noise in the places where silence had let predators thrive. After the press conference, after the interviews, after the handshakes and the business cards and the promises to stay in touch, Daniel and Thomas went back to the apartment and ordered pizza like they used to when Daniel was in high school, and they were both too tired to cook. They ate it sitting on the couch, watching a game neither of them cared about, and it was the most normal Daniel had felt in years. "You know," Thomas said, halfway through his 3rd slice, "when I took you in, I never imagined this. I thought maybe you'd finish high school, get a decent job, stay out of trouble. This whole billionaire philanthropist thing was not on my bingo card." Daniel laughed, the kind of laugh that came from someplace genuine and relieved. "Yeah, well, I'm still not great at staying out of trouble, I just got better at directing it. You directed it at the right people this time. That's what matters." Thomas set down his pizza, looked at Daniel with that steady gaze that had seen him through the worst years of his life. "I'm proud of you, son. Not because of the money or the company or any of that, because you saw something wrong and you didn't look away. Because you showed up. That's all any of us can do, really. Show up, and try to make it a little less terrible for the next person." "I learned that from you," Daniel said. "I know," Thomas smiled. "But you made it your own. That's the point. I gave you the foundation, you built the house." Outside, the city lights were coming on, turning San Francisco into something that looked almost magical from 40 stories up. Somewhere down there, someone was probably being exploited, being scammed, being left behind, by systems that were supposed to help them. And now, because of what happened on Maple Street, because of a 72-year-old veteran who'd been too proud to ask for help and a son who'd finally come home, there was one more resource for them to turn to, one more avenue for justice, one more person watching their back. It wasn't enough, it would never be enough, but it was something. And sometimes, Daniel was learning, something was how you started changing everything.